Have you ever heard the story of the foreign sisters who were British aristocrats? They also became famous in the 1930s for often scandalous reasons. Each was known in a different way: the Duchess, the Fascist, the Communist, the Nazi, the Novelist, and the other. So we ask ourselves, despite their fame, why did they cause so much controversy? Although their nicknames seem to say it all, there is much more to the story. The Mitford family, from which the 6 Mitford sisters are descended, can trace their roots to England before the Norman conquest of the country in the 11th century, when William the Conqueror crossed from France with his Norman knights and conquered England. The family was hated by Sir John de Mitford, who ruled Milford Castle in Northumberland, in the north of the country and on the border with Scotland. Incredibly, the Mitfords maintained a landed presence here for the next 800 years. The sisters' father was David Bertram Olgaley Freeman Mitford, the second Baron, who gave his name to the English period. He was notoriously eccentric, but the family was relatively successful. For example, her great-grandfather had been a prominent British historian in the early 19th century. Their mother was Sidney Bowes, whose father Thomas was a member of a parliament and a prominent writer and editor who founded several of the most famous British magazines of the day, including the original Vanity Fair. David and Sidney had a total of 7 children after their marriage in 1904. The eldest, Nancy, was born a few months after their wedding. Pamela was born in 1907, followed shortly thereafter by Thomas, their only son, in January 1909. Their third daughter was born in 1910. There was a hiatus before Unity was born in August 1914, a few days after the outbreak of World War I, in which David was serving. Jessica was born in 1917, followed by Deborah in 1920. Thomas would only live into his mid-30s as he was still in action during the final months of World War II in 1945, fighting in the Pacific Theater. Though nearly all of the sisters would live long lives, they were greatly influenced by their parents. David was staunchly conservative, while Sarah flirted with fascism in the 1930s and 1940s. This eventually led to their separation in 1943, in the midst of World War II. But, as you will see, the political controversies of the Mitford family ran even deeper into the present. The Mitford sisters' ancestors established their reputation for intelligence and dysfunction. The girls were raised in a rather isolated manner, were chaotically homeschooled, and suffered from having 2 distant and erratic parents. As a result, Nancy turned to the extensive library at her home, Batsworth's house, where her literary aspirations first developed. She was introduced to British high society on her 18th birthday in 1922 and went on to become a formidable figure in the interwar years. Nancy had the opportunity to form friendships with esteemed writers of the time, such as Evelyn Waugh and John Betjeman. This occurred in her role as one of the most publicly visible members of the so-called Bright Young Things, a group of young individuals from the British aristocracy and upper middle class. This group became widely known in 1920s Britain both for their extravagant parties marked by heavy drinking and for their artistic and literary work. In 1933, Nancy married Peter Rodd, the son of Sir Reynold Rodd, a British diplomat and politician. It was an unhappy marriage that would eventually end in divorce in 1957. During this time, Nancy also had a long courtship with Erskine Hamish, the son of the Earl of Rosalind, but it did not result in marriage. Nancy was apparently unaware that Hamish was gay, and at one point he was involved in a relationship with her younger brother, Tom. It was in the 1930s that Nancy first began to focus on writing, securing a regular columnist position at Lady, one of the magazines founded by her maternal grandfather. She also published her first novel, Highline Fling, in 1931, the first of 8 novels she would write. Although their marriage was failing by the late 1930s and they would not divorce until 1957, Nancy and Rod essentially lived separately from the late 1930s on. During World War II, Nancy became involved with a French officer, Gaston Pavlovsky, who came to England after France fell to the Nazis in the summer of 1940. They began a passionate romance, and it's clear that he was the love of her life. After the war ended in 1945, they settled together in France, marking the second notable period of her career. During this period, Nancy devoted herself to writing as a historian. In the 1950s, she worked on and published major biographical studies of such 18th century figures as King Louis XIV of France, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Madame Pompadour, and the French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. Unfortunately, her relationship with Pavlovsky did not survive the years, and she began to suffer from cancer in the 1960s. Nancy died in Paris in 1973. In many ways, Pamela lived the least conspicuous life of the six Mitford sisters, although, as you will see, some of her siblings attracted attention for all the wrong reasons. She was a reserved woman who enjoyed a simply country life. As a result, she was known as the Quiet Mitford and the Forgotten Sister. However, her marriage in 1936 to Derek Jackson, a wealthy and respected atomic physicist, attracted public attention, especially because Jackson was a notorious bisexual who eventually married 6 times and had a series of love affairs. He also quickly became anti-Semitic. They were united by their love of horseback riding, but eventually divorced in 1951. Pamela then became the close companion of an Italian woman named Giuditta Tomasini. It is widely believed that their relationship was sexual and that Pamela was bisexual. However, they separated in the early 1970s. Pamela lived a quiet life in the Cotswolds in London until 1994. Pamela fell down a steep flight of stairs, broke 2 bones in her legs, and despite an operation from which she never recovered, she died in hospital on April 12, 1994, at the age of 86. The myth of the middle sister, for Diana and Unity, was undoubtedly the most controversial one they adopted after their mother, whose politics were scandalous and who refused to renounce her support for fascism during World War II. It was a trait she shared with only Mitford's brother, Tom, who had joined the Nazis during a visit to Berlin in the late 1920s and was sent to fight against the Italians or Japanese during World War II when he refused to take up arms against the Germans. In Diana's case, her relationship with fascism was extremely public, although she had married Brian Walter Guinness, heir to the barony of Moyne, in 1929 when she was only 19. This first marriage soon began to disintegrate after Diana met Oswald Mosley, who was 14 years her senior and belonged primarily to the British lower aristocracy. He had been a promising figure in British politics in the 1920s, serving as a Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government between 1929 and 1931. By then, however, Mosley had become disillusioned with mainstream British politics, and much of Europe was being swept up by more extreme political ideologies following the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression. Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists in 1932. It was around this time that he and Diana met at the garden party. Both were married, but Diana soon left her first husband, and Mosley's wife died in 1933. From then on, their courtship developed steadily, and they were married in 1936 at the home of German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels in Berlin. It is worth noting that Adolf Hitler attended the ceremony. Although the British Union and fascists provided support in Britain during the 1930s, once war with Germany began in September 1939, this support evaporated in 1940s when Germany began its invasion and occupation of Western Europe, followed by the bombing of Britain. Oswald and Diana were imprisoned by the government and remained there until 1943, when the war turned against Germany and figures like Mosley were no longer considered a significant threat to British internal security. After the conflict, Sheena Oswald could no longer live in Britain and moved to France. There, she developed a considerable literary career. After the war, she edited The European, a magazine with pro-fascist leanings, and for a time became a reviewer. The New Stateswoman did not repent of her fascist past until her death in Paris in 2003 at the age of 93. Diana shared her support for fascism with her younger sister Unity, who was born in 1914 and came of age in the early 1930s, as Europe's political landscape became increasingly polarized. She shared a room with her sister Jessica, who was her ideological opposite. In the moment of adolescence, they drew a chalk line down the middle of the room, with Unity decorating her half with a Nazi washcloth and the portrait of Adolf Hitler, while Jessica hung a communist sickle and hammer and a photograph of Vladimir Lenin. As Unity entered early adulthood, she was drawn into the world of British and German fascism through her sister Diana's relationship with Oswald Mosley in 1933, when she was only 19 years old. The sisters attended the Nazi Party rally in the city of Nuremberg, the first of the major demonstrations after the Nazi Party took power in Germany. Unity returned to Germany the following year to study at a language school in Munich, but her real purpose seems to have been to meet Hitler in person. She accomplished this feat several months later. It is clear that she attempted to woo the Nazi dictator, who was 25 years her senior, and throughout 1935 and 1936, she tried to ingratiate herself with the Nazi leader. These efforts ultimately proved futile, as Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun became more serious in the mid-1930s. By 1936, however, Unity had become part of the inner circle of the Nazi leadership. Her vigorous anti-Semitism, which overshadowed that of other members of her family, such as Diana and Tom, was evident, and she was monitored by MI5 for her activities in Germany when war broke out in September 1939. Hitler warned Unity and her sister Diana that they must return to their home in Great Britain. Unity was devastated, and later that day, she tried to commit suicide by shooting herself in the head. Hitler paid her medical bills, and she made a partial recovery. Unity finally returned to England in early 1940s, although her injuries had caused brain damage from which she never fully recovered. These are the most fascinating aspects of her story, because it is believed that she entered a maternity hospital and may have given birth to a child shortly thereafter that was put up for adoption. The records on this matter are very confusing. This, in turn, has fueled speculations over the decades that Unity gave birth to a child of Hitler, who lived somewhere in Britain during the second half of the 20th century. She was probably unaware of her own ancestry, but there is no concrete evidence to support this assumption. If Unity did give birth to a child during the war, it was most likely fathered by John Andrews, an RAF pilot with whom she had a brief relationship at the time. Unity's health deteriorated throughout the 1940s due to lingering complications from her suicide attempt in 1939. She died in 1948 at the age of 33 from meningitis caused by brain disease. The swelling around the bullet in her head occurred while Diana and Unity were openly associated with British and German fascists in the 1930s and 1940s. In contrast, her younger sister Jessica embraced ideology opposing political views, reacted strongly against her conservative and aristocratic upbringing, and disparaged her parents' politics in rebellion. At 19, she married her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, who had just returned from fighting with the communists in the Spanish Civil War. They spent some time in North America in the late 1930s, always short of money despite their backgrounds, when World War II broke out. Esmond joined the Royal Canadian Air Force but was killed in action in November 1941 when his plane disappeared on the return leg of bombing mission over Nazi Germany. The second chapter of Jessica's life began in 1943 when she married an American civil rights lawyer named Robert Trollhoff. They moved to California, where she became a U.S. citizen the following year. There, they both joined the activities of the American Communist Party, which led them to the forefront of the House Un-American Activities Committee in the mid-1950s, at the height of Senator Joseph McCarthy's presidency. But the Red Scare really took hold in the 1960s, when Jessica's fame began to grow, making her one of the most prominent investigative journalists in the United States, exposing the dark side of everything from funeral business in the United States to her early writings on the American prison system. She has written many books, including an autobiography, D and Rebels, which explores the politics and strange background of her family. Jessica Mitford was praised by the likes of Christopher Hitchens and J.K. Rowling for her courageous political beliefs in journalism. She eventually died of lung cancer in 1996 at the age of 78. Deborah, the youngest of the Mitford sisters, lived a remarkable life, but one that can be contrasted with the good and bad deeds of some of her other siblings. In 1941, at the height of World War II, she married Lord Andrew Cavendish, son of the Duke of Devonshire, one of the oldest and wealthiest line of the British aristocracy, and home of the Lords of Chatsworth, one of England's finest estate in the middle of the Peak District. Deborah's main claim to fame was somewhat less controversial than some of her siblings. She became the public face of Chatsworth's house, overseeing its development into one of England's finest stately homes, complete with its own gardens and tourist services. She also sponsored the renovation of several small villages on the outskirts of the vast Chatsworth estate, wrote several books about Chatsworth, its history and current state, and also spearheaded the renovation of a large house. As a result, Chatsworth's house is now one of the most acclaimed tourist attractions in the north of England. Politically, she leaned more towards Jessica and became a member of the left-wing Social Democratic Party in the 1980s. Deborah died in 2014 at the age of 94. Although this entire story ended after 110 years, it still resonates. There are many mysteries and stories to be unraveled about this family. 6 sisters, each in her own way, who managed to reach the highest political and economic heights. Women who don't beat around the bush or waste their time. And I'm sure this legacy doesn't end here. There's much more to see. That's why I invite you to subscribe and click the bell to see more videos like this.